In a society ruled by samurai, what if the most powerful people weren't warriors, but women who sold desire? Not just desire, but an ideal of beauty, art, and status so exclusive it could destroy the fortunes of a feudal lord. This was a power wielded not with a sword, but with a glance. A power built on silk and ceremony and secrets. This is the story of the Oiran, the superstar courtesans of Edo, Japan. They were masters of art and conversation, living in a world of staggering luxury. To understand their power, we must journey back in time into the heart of a city of pleasure. If the idea of a hidden world of power and intrigue fascinates you, consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. We'd also love to hear your initial thoughts in the comments. What comes to mind when you think of historical Japan? Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we pull back the silk curtains on the floating world, a place built for pleasure, art, and the ambitions of a rising merchant class. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the bustling streets of Edo. Our journey starts in a time of profound quiet. The year is 1603. Japan has just emerged from more than a century of relentless civil war. The land was scarred. The people were weary of bloodshed. A powerful warrior named Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified the nation. He established a new military government, the Tokugawa shogunate. His primary goal was simple: stability. He wanted a peace so absolute, so unshakable, that war would become a distant memory. And for more than 250 years, he succeeded. This long, quiet era would be known as the Edo period, named after its new capital city, Edo, the future Tokyo. But peace, as it turns out, has its own consequences. To ensure this newfound stability, the shogunate created a rigid social order. It was a ladder with 4 main rungs, and you could not easily move from the one you were born on. This system was known as Shi no Kei Sho. At the very top were the samurai, the warrior class. They were the rulers and administrators. They were defined by honor, by their swords, and by their loyalty to their lords. Yet in this new era of peace, they were warriors with no wars to fight. Below the samurai were the farmers. In the eyes of the government, they were the noble foundation of the entire nation. They produced the rice that fed everyone. Their work was vital, their role respected in principle, if not always in practice. The third rung belonged to the artisans, the carpenters who built the cities, the weavers who made the silk, the swordsmiths whose craft was now more art than necessity. They were the makers, the creators of the objects that filled daily life. And at the very bottom, the fourth and lowest class, were the merchants. In the official Confucian philosophy, merchants were seen as parasites. They produced nothing. They simply moved goods from one place to another, profiting from the labor of others. They were disdained by the samurai elite. But this new, peaceful Japan needed them. And in the bustling cities, the merchants began to thrive. They built vast fortunes, their storehouses overflowing with rice, silk, and timber. A deep irony began to take root in Japanese society. The samurai at the top had all the status, but their wealth was fixed, paid in stipends of rice that often lost value. Meanwhile, the merchants at the bottom had all the money. They grew fantastically wealthy, but they were barred from owning farmland or holding political office. They could buy any luxury they desired, but they could never buy respect. They could never buy status. This imbalance created a powerful tension. What do you do when you have wealth, but no legitimate way to show it? You create your own world, a world with its own rules and its own definition of status. The shogunate inadvertently fueled this new world with a clever policy called Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance. This law required every feudal lord or daimyo to spend every other year living in the capital city of Edo. The daimyo had to travel in grand processions, with hundreds of retainers, their journey a spectacular display of their domain's wealth. It was a massive expense, designed to keep the lords too poor to finance rebellions. But it had an unintended side effect. It turned Edo into a non-stop economic engine. The lords needed mansions, servants, fine clothes, and entertainment. This constant influx of aristocrats and their needs poured unimaginable wealth into the hands of the city's artisans and merchants. Edo swelled into one of the largest cities on the planet, a bustling, crowded, and vibrant metropolis. And it was here, in the city's restless heart, that the merchants began to spend their fortunes. They couldn't buy land. They couldn't buy power. So they bought pleasure. They bought art. They bought fleeting, beautiful moments of escape from their rigid lives. This new cultural sphere came to be known as the ukiyo. The word ukiyo originally had a very different meaning. In its Buddhist origins, it meant the sorrowful world. It spoke of the transient, painful nature of mortal life, a realm of suffering from which one should seek release. But in the peace of the Edo period, the word was playfully repurposed. A different character was used, one that sounded the same, but meant to float. The sorrowful world became the floating world. The meaning was transformed. Life was still transient, yes, but instead of seeing this as a source of sorrow, the people of the floating world chose to see it as a reason for celebration. If life is but a fleeting dream, a brief moment before we fade, then let us make that dream as beautiful and entertaining as possible. Let us float along on the currents of pleasure. Let us seize the day. This philosophy became the driving force of a new urban culture, a culture of style, of wit, of glamour. The main hubs of this floating world were the three great cities of Japan. Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital, was the center of traditional arts and refinement. Osaka, the kitchen of Japan, was a city of merchants and trade. And then there was Edo, the shogun's city. It was the dynamic, energetic, and fashionable heart of the ukiyo. It was here that the culture reached its most spectacular expression. Entertainment blossomed. The kabuki theater offered thrilling tales of love, honor, and revenge, with superstar actors who became idols. The sumo wrestling ring offered displays of power and strength, drawing huge crowds. And at the very center of it all were the pleasure quarters. These were districts officially licensed by the government, designed as walled-in worlds dedicated entirely to entertainment and desire. Of all these districts, one name stood above all others: Yoshiwara. It was here, in the heart of the floating world, that our story truly takes shape. The Yoshiwara was not just any pleasure quarter. It was the pleasure quarter, the official, government-sanctioned heart of Edo's nightlife. A city within a city, with its own laws, its own language, and its own queens. Its story began in 1617, when the shogunate decided to corral the city's burgeoning and chaotic prostitution trade into a single manageable area. The original district was built near Nihonbashi, in the heart of Edo. Its name meant reed field, a nod to the marshy land upon which it was built. For 40 years, it flourished there. But in 1657, a catastrophe struck. The Great Fire of matriarchy raged through Edo for 3 days. It consumed nearly 70% of the city, a terrifying sea of flames that claimed over 100,000 lives. The Yoshiwara was burned to the ground. When the city was rebuilt, the government saw an opportunity. They decided to move the district, to push it further away from the city's respectable center. The new district, called Shin Yoshiwara, or New Yoshiwara, was built on reclaimed farmland on the northern outskirts of Edo. This distance was deliberate. It was meant to make pleasure an intentional journey, a destination you had to seek out, rather than something you might stumble upon. And it was designed for one purpose: control. The entire district was surrounded by a wide, deep moat. Like a castle, it was cut off from the outside world. This water barrier was both practical and symbolic. It separated the rigid, everyday world of work and family from the fluid, fantastical world of the ukiyo. There was only one way in and one way out. A single, heavily guarded checkpoint known as the Great Gate or the Umon. To enter Yoshiwara was to pass through this portal, leaving your social status and your ordinary life behind you. Every visitor, whether a great lord or a humble merchant, had to pass through the same gate. It was the great equalizer. Inside, money was the only rank that truly mattered. Once through the gate, you would find yourself on the district's grand main avenue, Nakano-sho. This was the glittering heart of Yoshiwara. It was a wide street, famously lined with cherry trees that would burst into a cloud of pink blossoms in the spring. The buildings on either side were tea houses and the great brothel houses, their facades glowing with the soft light of paper lanterns. It was a world designed to enchant, to overwhelm the senses with beauty and promise. This was the stage where the district's nightly dramas unfolded. But you could not simply walk up to one of the grand houses and request the company of a high-ranking courtesan. The system was far more complex and far more exclusive than that. The real gatekeepers of Yoshiwara were the tea houses or chaya. These establishments acted as the essential intermediaries. A man seeking the company of a top courtesan would first go to a tea house where he had a connection. He would host a party there, proving his wealth and sophistication. Only then would the tea house staff, if they deemed him worthy, summon the courtesan on his behalf. The tea houses were the social filters, ensuring that only men of sufficient means and proper etiquette could even approach the district stars. Within these walls, a unique world evolved. It even had its own dialect, a particular accent and vocabulary known as the Karuwa Kotoba. This quarter language was an elegant, stylized form of speech. It served a crucial purpose. Most of the women who worked in Yoshiwara came from poor rural families all across Japan. Their native accents would instantly reveal their humble origins. The Karuwa Kotoba erased their past. It gave them a shared, sophisticated voice, making them seem like creatures born and bred within this world of high-class pleasure. It was another layer of artifice, another element of the fantasy. The district also operated on a strict schedule. At 10 o'clock every night, a bell would sound. The great gate was locked. No one could enter or leave until morning. This curfew had two effects. It allowed the guards to control the district, and it created a sense of delicious entrapment for the patrons inside. To be locked in Yoshiwara for the night was to be completely immersed in the floating world. with no connection to the duties and responsibilities waiting outside. For the shogunate, the entire system of Yoshiwara was a masterstroke of social engineering. They understood that male desire could not be eliminated, so instead they chose to contain it, to tax it, and to profit from it. Yoshiwara was a pressure valve for a rigidly controlled society, a place where the wealthy merchant class could spend their fortunes without threatening the established political order. It was a gilded cage, but for the men who visited, it felt like a paradise. For the women inside, it was a much more complicated reality, a world built upon a strict and unforgiving ladder. The term courtesan can be misleading. It suggests a single type of woman, but inside Yoshiwara, this was not the case. The district was a fiercely hierarchical society, a ladder of rank and privilege where a woman's status determined every aspect of her existence. At the very bottom of this ladder were the lowest-ranking prostitutes, the hashi-joro. These were the women who sat in houses with lattice storefronts, their faces visible to any man walking by. They were displayed like objects for sale, available for a low price to any customer who could afford them. They had little training, wore simple kimono, and were often the most desperate. Theirs was a life of anonymity and hardship, a stark and sorrowful reality at the base of the glittering world. A step above them were the mid-tier courtesans, known as koshijoro. They also sat behind a lattice, but they enjoyed a slightly higher status. Perhaps they were more beautiful or possessed some small artistic skill. Their price was higher, and their clients were of a slightly better class. Yet they were still very much on display, their availability a matter of public negotiation. And then, at the absolute pinnacle of this complex world, were the stars, the celebrities, the women known as the Oiran. The Oiran were in a class entirely of their own. You would never see an Oiran sitting behind a lattice. She would never solicit a client. To even be in her presence was an immense privilege, one that had to be earned through a display of fantastic wealth and impeccable manners. The name Oiran itself hints at their special status. It is said to come from a phrase used by their young attendants, Oira no Tokoro no Nizan, which loosely translates to the elder sister at our place. It was a familiar, almost intimate title used by those within her inner circle. To be an Oiran was to be the head of a family, the leader of a small court. Technically, there was one rank that had once been even higher, the Taiyu. The Taiyu were the original queens of the pleasure quarters, especially in the more traditional city of Kyoto. They were known for their mastery of high arts and their aristocratic bearing. However, by the middle of the 18th century, the Taiyu had all but vanished from Edo's Yoshiwara. Their rituals had become too formal, too demanding, even for the floating world. With their disappearance, the Oiran was left as the undisputed queen of the district. An Oiran's power was defined by her ability to refuse. She was not a commodity to be bought, but a star to be courted. The entire dynamic of power was flipped on its head. The wealthy client, a man used to getting whatever he wanted, was placed in the position of a supplicant. He had to prove himself worthy of her attention. Her status was visible in everything around her. She did not walk alone. She was always accompanied by a retinue, a clear sign of her importance. This entourage included 2 young girls, her komuro. These were her personal attendants and trainees, often as young as 7 or 8 years old. They dressed in fine, matching kimonos and mimicked her every move, learning the ways of the quarter through observation. She would also be attended by several teenage apprentices, known as Shinzo. These were girls who had graduated from being Kamuro and were now in the final stages of their education, hoping to one day become Oiran themselves. The Oiran's entire existence was a performance of luxury and exclusivity. What she offered her clients was not merely a physical encounter. That was a small, almost secondary part of the arrangement. What a patron truly paid for was a complete experience. An evening of art, intellect, and the illusion of romance. He paid for the privilege of being seen with her, of basking in her reflected glory. He paid for her conversation, her wit, her musical skill, and her companionship. She was the ultimate luxury good. Her value was derived from her rarity, her talent, and her profound desirability. This status was never more apparent than when she made her most famous public appearance, a spectacle that would bring the entire district to a standstill. Imagine a street in Yoshiwara. The air is thick with the scent of incense and cherry blossoms. The light from hundreds of paper lanterns casts a warm, dreamy glow. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Then a hush falls. She is coming. This was the Oiran Doge, the procession of the courtesans. It was the parade an Oiran would make when summoned by a wealthy client, walking from her house to the designated tea house where he waited. But this was no simple walk. It was a major public spectacle, a piece of performance art, and the ultimate advertisement for her beauty and status. The first thing you would notice was the costume. The Oiran wore multiple layers of the most lavish silk kimonos, intricately embroidered with scenes from nature or mythology. These garments were masterpieces of textile art, their colors bold and their designs unique. Together, these layers could weigh over 20 kilograms, or 44 pounds. It was a costume of immense beauty, but also immense burden, restricting her movement to a slow, deliberate pace. Her hair was a work of art in itself. She wore a distinctive, elaborate style known as the date hyugo. Her hair was sculpted and held in place with wax, forming large, dramatic wings on either side of her head. This structure was then adorned with an astonishing number of large hairpins, or kanzashi. These were not simple pins. They were crafted from precious materials like tortoiseshell, silver, gold, and coral. A top Oiran might wear a dozen or more of these heavy, shimmering ornaments, a fortune glittering in her hair. But the most striking element of her appearance, the one that truly defied belief, was her footwear. She wore towering wooden clogs, known as sanmai bagdita. These were not ordinary shoes. They were black lacquered platforms that could be over 20 centimeters or 8 inches tall. To walk in them at all was a feat of incredible balance and strength. To move in this heavy costume and these impossible shoes, the Oiran had to use a very specific and difficult walking style. It was called suriashi, a gliding figure-eight motion. She would swing her foot out in a slow, graceful arc before planting it. Each step was a carefully choreographed movement, turning a simple walk into a mesmerizing dance. She did not make this journey alone. She was the center of a solar system of attendants. A male servant would walk beside her, holding a large, elegant paper parasol over her head to protect her pale, powdered skin from the elements. Leading the way were her young Kamuro, the little attendants in their matching kimonos, their faces serious with concentration. Following behind were her teenage Shinzo, apprentices who hoped to one day command such a procession themselves. As she moved down Nakano-cho, the entire street would stop. Merchants, patrons, and other courtesans would pause their business to watch her pass. It was a display of power that everyone understood. The sheer expense of her costume, her retinue, and the ceremony itself, all of it was being billed to the client who had summoned her. The procession was a testament to her value, and to the wealth of the man who could afford her. To see an Oiran pass by was like catching a glimpse of a goddess who had descended to earth. She was a living work of art, an icon of the floating world. The sight of an Oiran was a spectacle of wealth and power. As we continue, we will discover the years of hardship and training required to become one of these living works of art. If you are enjoying this journey into the floating world, please let us know in the comments. The procession of an Oiran was a breathtaking spectacle, a vision of power and beauty that seemed almost divine. But the woman at the center of that parade was not born a goddess. She was made one. Her journey was one of profound transformation, beginning in the poverty of the countryside and culminating in the highest echelons of the floating world. It was a path that demanded the complete surrender of her old life in exchange for a new one of unimaginable luxury and unimaginable debt. The story of almost every great Oiran begins in the same place, not in a glittering city, but in a quiet rural village. It begins with hardship, a failed harvest, a crippling tax, a family facing starvation. For countless impoverished farmers and fishermen during the Edo period, their daughters were their only remaining asset. And so, a heartbreaking choice was made. A young girl, often no older than 5 or 7, would be sold. A transaction was rarely so crude. It was framed as a contract, an advance on her future earnings. The brothel owner would pay the family a sum of money to relieve their immediate suffering, and in return, the girl would enter a period of indentured servitude that would last for most of her young life. Imagine that little girl, saying goodbye to her parents, to her home, to the only world she has ever known. Her journey to the city of Edo would have been terrifying and bewildering. The noise, the crowds, the sheer scale of the capital was a world away from the quiet fields of her village. And then she would arrive at the great gate of Yoshiwara. For a child, passing through that gate was like stepping into a fairy tale or a nightmare, a world of silk and lanterns, of strange music and even stranger rules. One of the very first things to happen upon her arrival was the loss of her name. The name her parents gave her, the name that tied her to her family and her past, was taken away. She was given a new. This practice, which might seem shocking today, was a key part of life in Yoshiwara. The large sum paid for them as wage was a vital boost for the brothel, helping to clear a chunk of the significant debt that the young woman had built up over years of training, clothing, and living expenses. It was a tough process, but it marked an important milestone, officially recognizing her skills and transitioning her from a trainee to a valuable performer. Name: a child's name suitable for her new role. This was a powerful and symbolic act. It was the moment she ceased to be her father's daughter and became a daughter of Yoshiwara. Her new life was that of a komuro, a little attendant. She would be assigned to a high-ranking Oiran who would become her older sister. Her life was now a mixture of menial labor and intense observation. She would run errands, carry her older sister's personal belongings, and perform endless small chores around the brothel. But all the while, she was learning. She was a little shadow, watching the Oiran's every move. She saw how she walked, how she talked, how she applied the thick white makeup to her face. She watched her perform the tea ceremony, arrange flowers, and play the shamisen. She saw how she interacted with wealthy and powerful men, how she could command a room with a single glance. The relationship with her older sister was the most important of her young life. A kind Oiran might treat her with affection, guiding her as a true mentor. A cruel one might see her as little more than a servant, a convenient target for her own frustrations. The girl's future prospects often depended entirely on the success and goodwill of the Oiran she served. She lived in a world of women and girls. She shared rooms with other Komuro, all of them bound by the same fate. They were dressed in beautiful matching kimonos, a visual symbol that they all belonged to the same house. This finery was a part of the illusion. It made them look like precious dolls, but it was a uniform, marking them as property. This period of her life was an immersive apprenticeship in the ways of the quarter. Day by day, she absorbed the unique dialect, the Karua Katoba, until her rural accent was just a faint memory. She learned the complex etiquette, the names of important patrons, and the intricate hierarchy of the houses. And with every passing day, a number grew larger. A number she probably could not yet comprehend, but which would define her entire existence. The debt, the initial price paid to her family, was just the beginning. The cost of her food, her lodging, her medical care, and especially her beautiful clothes, was all being carefully recorded on a ledger. She was an investment, a piece of raw material that the brothel hoped to shape into a profitable asset. From the moment she entered Yoshiwara, she was bound by a chain of debts so heavy it would take her a lifetime to pay off. Her childhood was not a time of carefree play, but the first stage of a long and arduous career. It was a gilded cage, and the door was locked from the outside. After several years of learning through observation and servitude, the young apprentice was ready for the next stage of her transformation. Her formal education would begin. This was the process that would elevate her from a simple attendant into a potential work of art. To become an Oiran, it was not enough to be beautiful. She had to become a master of the traditional Japanese high arts. This education was extraordinarily rigorous and extraordinarily expensive. Each new skill she learned was another entry in the ledger of her debt, but it was also a step up the ladder of status. These accomplishments were what would one day separate her from the common prostitutes and justify her immense price. Her days became a blur of lessons with master teachers, each one a specialist in their field. One of the first disciplines was calligraphy, or shado. She would spend countless hours learning to grind the inkstick into a pool of perfect velvety black. She would practice holding the brush, her small hand learning the precise pressure and flow needed to create elegant characters. This was not just about penmanship. The ability to write a beautiful, poetic letter was a vital tool of her future trade. A witty verse or a thoughtful note, written in an elegant hand, could captivate a patron's heart far more effectively than a simple conversation. From the art of the brush, she moved to the art of the word. She had to study classical poetry, particularly the form known as waka. She learned its strict syllable structure, its themes of love and nature, and its subtle expressions of emotion. She was expected not just to recite the classics, but to compose her own poems, to engage in witty, poetic banter with educated men. Her body, too, had to be trained in grace and precision. She was taught the intricate rituals of the tea ceremony, or sadoi. In a quiet, serene room, she would learn the hundreds of specific choreographed movements: how to fold the silk napkin, how to hold the bamboo whisk, how to present the bowl to a guest. The tea ceremony was a lesson in mindfulness, a moving meditation that taught her discipline, poise, and how to create a moment of perfect, tranquil beauty for her patrons. This sense of beauty extended to the art of flower arranging. Ikebana, she learned that it was not about creating a dense, colorful bouquet. It was a spiritual practice, an art of lines, of space, and of asymmetry. She learned to see the character in a single bent branch and to create a composition that was a harmonious reflection of nature. Then came the music. Her fingers, small and nimble, would learn the pain and dedication required to master an instrument. She would spend years practicing the koto, a long 13-stringed zither whose notes flow like a river. She would also have to master the shamisen, a 3-stringed lute whose sound could be both lively and deeply melancholic. The twang of the shamisen was the signature sound of the floating world, and to play it well was an essential skill. Her fingertips would become hard and calloused, a hidden sign of her long years of dedication. Even her leisure had to be refined. She was taught to play traditional board games, especially Go. This was far more than a simple pastime. Go is a game of immense strategic depth, a silent battle of wits and patience. To play it well was a sign of a sharp and disciplined mind. Finally, she learned the art of traditional dance, or Nihon Buyo. This was not a dance of high kicks and fast spins. It was an art of subtlety and suggestion. Using graceful movements and the expressive power of a fan, she could tell stories, evoke emotions, and create a vision of timeless elegance. Each of these skills was a pearl, strung one by one onto the necklace of her identity. The cost of this education was staggering, sinking her deeper and deeper into debt. But it was also her only path to power. It was the fire that would forge her from a simple girl into a woman of culture and refinement, capable of enchanting the most powerful men in Japan. To master the arts of music, dance, and ceremony was essential. But this alone did not make an Oiran. The final and most difficult education was in the art of the mind. An Oiran had to be more than an entertainer. She had to be a brilliant conversationalist, an intellectual peer to the men who sought her company. Her beauty might draw a man in, but it was her wit that would make him stay. It was her intelligence that would make him spend a fortune for the privilege of her time. This intellectual polish was the true secret of her power. She was trained to be sharp, witty, and engaging. She learned how to steer a conversation, how to deliver a clever compliment, and how to deflect an impertinent question with a graceful, smiling retort. Her mind was honed like a blade, sharp enough to impress, but sheathed in a scabbard of perfect etiquette. This required a formidable depth of knowledge. Her education was not limited to the arts. She was expected to be well-versed in the great works of classical Japanese and Chinese literature. She read the epic romances, the famous war chronicles, and the works of the great poets. She had to understand the subtle allusions and historical references that peppered the speech of educated men. To be able to catch a literary quote and respond with one of her own was a sign of immense sophistication. It showed she was not just a pretty face, but a mind worthy of respect. Her patrons were not simple men. They were powerful daimyo, samurai officials, and staggeringly wealthy merchants. They were men who spent their days navigating complex worlds of politics, business, and social intrigue. When they came to Yoshiwara, they were not always looking for a simple escape. Many sought something more. They sought a confidant, a woman who was not only beautiful and artistic, but also intelligent, perceptive, and above all, discreet. The tea house provided a unique space, a neutral ground where a man could let down his guard. In the intimate setting of a private room, with the sound of a distant shamisen drifting on the air, a patron might speak his mind freely. He might discuss a sensitive political appointment or a risky business venture he was considering. He could share his ambitions, his fears, and his frustrations. The Oiran's role was to listen. She was trained to be an exceptional listener, to understand what was said, and more importantly, what was left unsaid. Her opinion was valued. A thoughtful comment or a well-chosen poetic phrase from her could offer a fresh perspective, a moment of clarity for a man burdened by his responsibilities. This role as a keeper of secrets gave her a profound form of soft power. She became a repository of sensitive information. Her favor could enhance a man's reputation among his peers, while her rejection could be a source of deep public shame. To manage these complex interactions, she had to be a master of language. She could slip effortlessly from the formal, courtly language required for a high-ranking samurai to the witty, stylized dialect of the quarter, the Kurua Kotoba. Her voice was another instrument, one she could tune to suit any audience, any mood. Part of her immense allure was that she was never easily impressed. She had seen wealth. She had heard powerful men speak. A patron could not win her over simply by boasting of his riches or his rank. He had to earn her respect. He had to engage her mind, to prove that he was a man of substance and sophistication. This challenge was intoxicating. The intellectual dance, the artful conversation, was as much a part of the seduction as any physical beauty. It was this combination of artistic talent, intellectual depth, and personal charisma that created the Oiran's unique mystique and justified her legendary price. After a decade or more of relentless training, the day would finally come. The young apprentice, now a teenager of about 15 or 17, was ready to graduate. She would move from the rank of a young attendant, a komuro, to that of a shinzo, meaning new woman. There were several types of shinzo. Some were destined to become mid-level courtesans, their training complete. But the most promising girls, those who had mastered every art and showed the greatest potential, became Furazode Shinzo. They were named for the beautiful, long-sleeved kimonos they wore, a sign of their elite status as Oiran in training. For a Furazode Shinzo, the final step was her official debut. This was a grand, formal ceremony, a coming-out party that would present her to the exclusive world of Yoshiwara's high society. It was an incredibly expensive event, financed entirely by her brothel, adding another monumental sum to her lifelong debt. But it was the investment that would officially launch her career. The debut was a momentous occasion. It would be held in one of the finest rooms of her brothel, or in a high-class tea house. The guest list was a who's who of the quarter. The owner of her house would be there, along with the proprietors of the most important tea houses. Her older sister Oiran, who had mentored her, would be there as a proud sponsor. And most importantly, powerful and wealthy patrons would be invited, men who might one day become her clients. The heart of this ceremony was a ritual exchange of sake, similar to the one used in weddings. She would share cups of rice wine with her mentors, her managers, and her potential patrons. This act, known as Sansankudo, was a way of formally binding her to the community and to the men who would support her. It was a pledge of her new professional life. Then came the most significant moment of all. She would be given her new professional name, her yobina. Her childhood name was a distant memory. Her apprentice name was now cast aside. She was reborn, christened with a name that was poetic, elegant, and evocative. A name like morning mist, or river song, or little pine. This was her new identity, her brand, the name that would be whispered in the tea houses and immortalized in woodblock prints. Following her debut, another crucial and deeply somber event would take place. This was her mizwage. This term refers to a formal sponsorship, which for the highest-ranking courtesans involved the loss of her virginity. A wealthy and respected patron would be chosen for this role. He would pay an absolutely exorbitant fee for the honor. This practice, which might seem shocking today, was a key part of life in Yoshiwara. The large sum paid for the mizwage was a vital boost for the brothel, helping to clear a chunk of the significant debt that the young woman had built up over years of training, clothing, and living expenses. It was a tough process, but it marked an important milestone, officially recognizing her skills and transitioning her from a trainee to a valuable performer. After her debut and her mizwage, she was a fully fledged courtesan. Her name was now on the lips of the district's elite. The tea houses could now formally recommend her to clients. Her long and difficult journey of preparation was over. But a new journey was just beginning. Her debut was not a finish line. It was the starting line of a long and demanding race. The race to build a reputation, to attract loyal patrons, and to begin the monumental task of earning back her own freedom, one lavish party at a time. The Oiran's debut was only the beginning of her career. The path to securing her patronage was a complex dance of wealth, ritual, and power. As you relax and drift deeper, we'll next explore just how difficult and expensive it was to win her favor. To become an Oiran was a journey of immense discipline and sacrifice. It was a transformation from a simple country girl into a living work of art. But once she had made her debut, the focus of our story shifts. It shifts from the woman on the pedestal to the man in the crowd who gazes up at her. For him, a new journey was just beginning. A perilous and incredibly expensive quest to win her favor. A process governed by strict rituals, where the Oiran, not the client, held all the power. A wealthy merchant in Edo could buy almost anything he desired. A fine house, luxurious silks, the rarest delicacies. But he could not simply buy an Oiran. Her company could not be purchased like a commodity. It had to be earned. The process was a formal, multi-stage ordeal designed to test not only his wallet, but his character, his patience, and his sophistication. The journey did not begin at the gates of a grand brothel. It began with a quiet word, a subtle inquiry. The aspiring patron first needed an introduction to one of the high-end tea houses or Haikerijaya that managed the Oiran's bookings. Without a referral from an existing, respected client, a man had no hope of even starting the process. He had to be somebody, or at least know somebody. Once he secured this introduction, his first test would begin. He would meet with the tea house proprietress. She was one of the most powerful women in Yoshiwara, a shrewd judge of character and finance. She had seen countless men come and go. In a quiet, formal meeting over tea, she would assess him. His manners, his style of dress, the way he spoke. She would subtly probe the depth of his wealth. She was the first gatekeeper, and her approval was essential. If she deemed him a worthy candidate, she would allow him to proceed to the first formal step. This was the first meeting, or shakai, but this was a meeting unlike any other. He was required to host a lavish banquet, a party of spectacular expense. And the guest of honor, the Oiran he wished to meet, would not even be there. This initial banquet was a pure display of means. It was his audition. He had to book one of the finest rooms in the tea house. He had to order an extravagant meal, with course after course of exquisite food. He had to hire other entertainers, perhaps some musicians, or a few geisha, to create a lively and sophisticated atmosphere. The cost was enormous, enough to support a regular family for a year, and he was spending it all just to make a good impression on the staff of the tea house, to prove that he was the kind of man who did not care about cost. He was performing his wealth. If his performance was deemed impressive, if the tea house was satisfied that he was a man of sufficient substance, then, and only then, would they send a summons to the Oiran's house. This was the moment of great suspense. He had spent a fortune. He had put on a magnificent party. And now he could only wait, hoping she would deem him worthy of a glance. If she accepted, he would hear her coming before he saw her. The faint music and the distinctive sounds of the Oiran Dosi, her grand procession, would drift from the street outside. And he knew that the entire cost of this magnificent parade, from her kimono to her attendants, was being added to his bill. Then she would enter, a vision of silk and shimmering hairpins, her face a perfect, impassive mask. She was a goddess descending into the room. But she did not come to him. She would proceed to the opposite end of the chamber, to the seat of honor, the highest position in the room. She would seat herself, her attendants arranging her magnificent robes around her. And there she would stay. For the rest of the evening, the Oiran would not speak to him. She would not look at him. She would not acknowledge his presence in any way. She would not eat the food he had paid for, nor drink the expensive sake he had ordered. She was a silent, beautiful statue, observing everything. The prospective patron was now in the most difficult position imaginable. He had to continue as a gracious host. He had to laugh and talk and entertain his other guests, all while under the silent, unnerving gaze of the woman he was trying to impress. Every gesture was being scrutinized. A single misstep, a moment of awkwardness, a boastful comment, or a sign of impatience could mean immediate and permanent failure. It was the most expensive and nerve-wracking audition of his life. Surviving the silent judgment of the first meeting was a monumental achievement. The aspiring patron had proven his wealth. He had demonstrated a degree of poise under pressure. But he had won nothing yet. He had merely earned the right to try again. The path to an Oiran's favor was a marathon, not a sprint, and the second leg of the journey was just as demanding. He now had to arrange a second meeting. This meant repeating the entire process, and often at an even greater expense. Another lavish banquet had to be hosted. Another fortune had to be spent on food, drink, and entertainment. This was a test of his seriousness. Was he truly dedicated, or was his interest merely a passing fancy? On top of the cost of the party itself, this second meeting came with a new expectation. Gifts, and not just a single, simple gift for the Oiran. He was expected to present lavish presents to her entire court. He had to choose a beautiful, expensive gift for the Oiran herself, perhaps a rare piece of coral for a hairpin, or an exquisite bolt of silk for a new kimono. But that was just the beginning. He also had to present valuable gifts to her young Komuro, her teenage Shinzo, and even her personal maids and dressers. Furthermore, he was expected to bestow generous tips and gifts upon the entire staff of the tea house, from the powerful proprietress down to the servers. He had to give gifts to the musicians who played at his party. This was a test of his generosity. It showed that he understood the complex web of relationships that supported the Oiran, and that he was magnanimous enough to honor all of them. A stingy man would be seen as uncouth, unworthy of a woman of her stature. When the Oiran made her grand entrance for this second meeting, the dynamic would shift, but only slightly. This time, she would not sit at the far end of the room. She would take a seat a little closer to him. This small change in geography was a significant sign of progress, a privilege that had cost him a second fortune. Yet, she remained distant. He might earn a brief, formal acknowledgement, a slight inclination of her head, perhaps a single polite phrase of greeting exchanged through an intermediary, but there would be no real conversation. The judgment was still in progress. She was no longer just assessing his wealth. She had seen that. Now she was judging his character more deeply, his temperament, his spirit. Was he a patient man, or did he show flickers of frustration? Was his respect for her genuine, or was it a thin veneer hiding arrogance? Was his sophistication authentic, or was he merely playing a role? During this entire process, from the first inquiry to the last, the Oiran held the ultimate power, the power of absolute refusal. At any moment, for any reason she saw fit, she could decide that she did not like the client. She could refuse to ever see him again. This was known as being furere, or dumped. To be rejected by an Oiran was not a private matter. News traveled fast in the gossipy world of Yoshiwara. It was a matter of profound public humiliation for a wealthy and powerful man. It was a declaration that, for all his money and influence, his character had been weighed, and it had been found wanting. This threat of being furere hung over every expensive banquet, every carefully chosen gift, every strained attempt at polite conversation. It was this constant risk that made the courtship of an Oiran such a high-stakes, anxiety-fueled affair. The patron was not the one in control. He was a humble supplicant, hoping to be deemed worthy by his queen. After passing the two great trials, the test of wealth and the test of character, the patron was now on the cusp of his goal. He had spent a staggering amount of money. He had shown unwavering patience and impeccable generosity. He had endured the silent judgment of the Oiran not once, but twice. Now, he could request the crucial third meeting. The air at this third gathering was different. The tension of the earlier auditions was replaced by a feeling of profound anticipation. The patron had done everything that was required of him. He had proven himself worthy. This was the meeting where he would finally learn if he had been accepted. If all went well, the Oiran would make her customary grand entrance. But this time, when she entered the room, she would not stop at a distance. To the immense relief and triumph of the patron, she would gracefully move to the seat right beside him. This simple act was the signal he had been waiting for. He had passed the test. What followed was a small, beautiful ceremony that formalized their new relationship. A servant would bring out a special set of lacquered tableware. It might be a beautiful tray or a fine set of bowls. On these items, the patron's name would be written in elegant gold or black lacquer. A personal pair of chopsticks would be presented to him. This was the official sign of his acceptance. He was no longer a stranger, an outsider seeking admission. He was now a Najini, a familiar and intimate client. The house and the Oiran herself were officially recognizing him as one of her patrons. The fee he paid from this point forward would change its name. It was no longer just a fee for a party. It was now called the Najimikin, the familiarity money, a term that signified his new, more personal status. And now, for the first time, the Oiran would truly interact with him. the beautiful, silent statue would come to life. She would turn to him, offer a genuine smile, and pour sake into his cup with her own hands. Then, the conversation he had spent a fortune to hear would finally begin. He would experience firsthand the famous wit, the deep knowledge, and the captivating charm that lay beneath her stunning appearance. The relationship was no longer a formal audition. It was now a personal connection. Intimacy might follow after he became a najimi. It was now a possibility, a part of the multifaceted relationship he was building with her. But it was never guaranteed, and it always remained on her terms, a natural outcome of a growing bond rather than a transactional service. However, becoming a najimi did not grant him ownership or exclusivity. An Oiran of high rank would typically have several najimi. Each one was a recognized patron, and she would divide her time among them. The patron had not bought a wife or a mistress. He had earned the right to be in her exclusive social circle. To maintain his coveted position, he was expected to continue his lavish spending. He had to keep hosting parties, giving gifts, and demonstrating his loyalty and devotion. Becoming a najimi was the successful conclusion of a long and arduous courtship. But for the wealthiest and most devoted patrons, it was not the end of the story. It was merely the stepping stone to the ultimate prize, a goal so ambitious and so fantastically expensive that only a handful of men in all of Japan could ever hope to achieve it. For a patron who had become a najimi, the relationship with his chosen Oiran was a source of immense pride and pleasure. But for a select few, this was still not enough. The ultimate display of wealth, power, and devotion was to go one step further, to buy her freedom. This act was known as hiki shomen, and it involved buying out her entire contract from the brothel and removing her from Yoshiwara forever. This was not a simple transaction. It was the financial equivalent of ransoming a queen. The cost was so astronomically high that it became the stuff of legends and cautionary tales. It was a sum designed to be almost impossible to pay. The price was calculated based on several factors, each one adding a staggering amount to the total. First, the brothel had to be repaid for her original purchase price when she was a child. Then, the full cost of her decade or more of education had to be covered every lesson in music, dance, and calligraphy. Next came the cost of her magnificent wardrobe. Every priceless silk kimono, every intricately carved hairpin of coral and tortoiseshell was factored into the bill. This alone represented a massive fortune. But the largest part of the sum was compensation for the brothel's lost future earnings. A top Oiran was a huge source of revenue. The brothel owner had to be paid for all the money she would have earned for the rest of her career. And on top of all of that, a massive premium, a sort of thank you payment, was added for the owner's trouble. The final sum was equivalent to millions of modern-day dollars. It was a fortune that could, and sometimes did, bankrupt a daimyo, a powerful feudal lord. There were well-known stories of lords who ruined their entire domain's finances, spending all their tax revenue to ransom a single beloved courtesan. Yet, even if a man could assemble such a fortune, the deal was not guaranteed. The single most important factor was the Oiran's consent. A brothel owner could not sell her contract to a patron if she objected. This was perhaps her greatest and final power. She could not be sold against her will to a man she despised or disrespected. She retained the right to choose a life of continued servitude in Yoshiwara over a life of freedom with the wrong man. For the patron who succeeded, the act of ransoming an Oiran was the ultimate status symbol in Edo society. It was a public declaration of wealth so immense and devotion so deep that it could not be rivaled. The woman he freed would typically become his official wife or a cherished, exclusive mistress, housed in her own private residence. For the Oiran, it was one of the very few paths to a life outside the walls of the pleasure quarter. It was her chance at a different kind of existence. However, this freedom was often bittersweet. Even as the wife of a powerful man, she would often face the stigma of her past. In the rigid, formal society outside Yoshiwara, she would always be seen as different. It must be remembered that this event was exceptionally rare. It was the fairy tale ending that almost never happened. The vast majority of Oiran were never bought out. They worked until their late 20s, by which time their contract was considered fulfilled and their immense debt was settled. Upon retirement, most remained within the floating world. It was the only community they knew. Many became teachers for the next generation of girls, passing on their skills in music and conversation. Some, with enough savings, even became proprietors of their own tea houses, becoming powerful figures in the world that had once owned them. The immense cost to possess an Oiran shows that her value is calculated not just in beauty, but in art, intellect, and exclusivity. She was the ultimate luxury good. As our story continues, we'll see how this status made her a leader of culture and fashion for all of Japan. To win the favor of an Oiran was to conquer the most exclusive social summit in all of Edo, Japan. It was a testament to a man's wealth, his character, and his devotion. For the Oiran herself, this immense desirability was the source of a power that extended far beyond the walls of Yoshiwara. At the height of her glory, she was not merely a courtesan. She was an arbiter of taste, a whisper in the halls of power, and the undisputed queen of a culture that she shaped in her own magnificent image. In the vibrant, style-obsessed world of Edo, the Oiran were the ultimate fashion icons. They were the supermodels of their age, their every choice in clothing, makeup, and accessories scrutinized, admired, and copied by women across the social spectrum. From the wife of the wealthiest merchant to the common townsgirl, everyone looked to the Oiran of Yoshiwara to see what was beautiful. Their primary vehicle of influence was a new and popular form of art, the ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world. These were woodblock prints, and they served as the fashion magazines of the day. The creation of a single print was a collaborative art form, a small industry in itself. It began with a publisher who acted as a producer, commissioning the work. He would hire a famous artist who would paint a delicate master design in ink. This design was then passed to a master carver who would painstakingly chisel the intricate lines onto a block of cherry wood. Finally, a printer would apply the colors, using a separate, carefully registered block for each shade, and press the image onto fine paper. This process allowed for the creation of hundreds, even thousands of copies. The prints were affordable, and they flooded the city. They were the primary way the Oiran's style reached the public, spreading her influence far beyond the moat of Yoshiwara. Great artists of the era built their reputations creating bijinga, or pictures of beautiful women, and their most popular subjects were, by far, the famous Oiran. The legendary Kitagawa Utamaro, for instance, seemed to have an almost personal obsession with these women. His famous series of large-headed pictures of beautiful women were more than just fashion plates. He was a master of capturing subtle emotion. In his prince, we see an Oiran lost in thought while reading a letter, another with a hint of melancholy in her eyes, a third displaying a quiet, unshakable pride. He sold not just an image, but a personality, a story. Other masters like Suzuki Harunobu and Katsukoa Shunsho also filled the print shops with dazzling images showing the famous courtesans in idyllic scenes, composing a poem by a window, walking beneath falling cherry blossoms, or enjoying a cool evening on a boat on the Sumida River. These prints were a window into a fantasy life. The Oiran were the engine of the entire high-fashion industry. The most famous kimono makers in Edo would create their boldest and most innovative designs specifically for them. A new pattern perhaps featuring cranes for good fortune, or dramatic, swirling waves worn by a top Oiran would be the talk of the town, with copies appearing in shops almost immediately. Her entire look was a carefully constructed work of art. Her face was coated in the traditional white foundation called oshiroi, a paste made from rice powder that created a perfect, flawless canvas. Her lips were painted with a vibrant red pigment derived from safflower petals, called beni. For the highest-ranking courtesans, the lower lip was often painted in a way that gave it an iridescent green sheen in certain light, a highly prized and expensive effect. The way an Oiran dressed was a statement. Most famously, she tied her broad sash, or obi, at the front. For a respectable married woman, the knot was always tied neatly in the back. The front-tying obi was a clear and practical marker of the Oiran's profession, allowing her to dress and undress without assistance. But it was also a fashion statement, and the elaborate, decorative knots she perfected were often copied and adapted in more subdued forms by fashionable women of the merchant class. Her hairstyles were legendary. The grand, wing-like Daikyogo style was her signature, a complex architecture of hair and wax. While few women outside the quarter could replicate its full magnificence, its influence was seen everywhere, in higher, more voluminous styles that tried to capture a fraction of its glamour. This style was then crowned with her kanzashi, the numerous, heavy hairpins that were a direct advertisement of her rank and the wealth of her patrons. In modern terms, the Oiran were the first brand influencers. Her name was a guarantee of taste. Her face on a woodblock print could sell anything. She was a living advertisement for a lifestyle of ultimate luxury and refinement. Her power was not just in her beauty, but in her ability to create and dictate the very definition of beauty for an entire generation. She did not follow trends. She was the trend. Beyond the visible, glittering power of fashion, the Oiran wielded a more subtle, but perhaps more significant, form of influence. This was a soft power, wielded in the quiet, paper-walled rooms of the tea-houses, a power built on whispers, secrets, and the trust of the most powerful men in Japan. Why did these men, these hardened politicians and calculating merchants, confide in a courtesan? The psychology is complex. The tea-house was a unique sanctuary, a space free from the rigid hierarchies and political posturing of the shogun's castle or the merchant guild. In the presence of the Oiran, a man could shed his public persona. She, in turn, posed no direct threat to his authority. She was intelligent, but her world was officially separate from his. Her advice, therefore, often seemed more objective, less entangled in the power plays of his daily life. Her role as an intelligent and discreet confidant was her most precious asset. Her patrons were engaged in a constant, high-stakes game of politics and business. The tea-house became their sanctuary, a place to decompress and think. In this environment of trust, a man could speak his mind. He could complain about a political rival, speculate on the shifting price of silk, or discuss a sensitive negotiation. The Oiran, with her years of training in perception and conversation, was the perfect audience. She listened without judgment, her presence both calming and stimulating. Her intelligence was key. She was not a passive listener. She could offer a thoughtful opinion, often couched in a line from a classic poem, that could provide a patron with a new perspective on his troubles. This influence could be used in concrete ways. Her favor could subtly signal a man's rising status within the elite circles of Edo. For example, a young merchant aspiring to do business with a powerful samurai official might learn that the official is a devoted patron of the Oiran Sagawa. That merchant might then spend a fortune to become an agini of Sagawa himself, not necessarily for her companionship, but simply for the opportunity to be in the same room as the official, to be seen by him, and to earn a measure of credibility through their shared taste. The Oiran became a social bridge between worlds. She became a keeper of an incredible amount of sensitive information. She knew which lords were in financial trouble, which merchants were planning a new venture, and which officials were currying favor at the shogun's court. This information, in her hands, was a form of power. While her code of discretion was absolute, she could use this knowledge in subtle ways. A patron she favored might find her conversation turning, as if by chance, to the topic of opportunity in the lumber market, just after she had heard another patron complain of a shortage. Conversely, a patron who earned her disrespect might find his reputation subtly tarnished. She would never be so crude as to gossip, but a well-timed, poetic sigh about the cold winds of winter approaching a certain man's house could be enough to warn another patron away from a risky business partnership. In this way, the grand tea-houses of Yoshiwara functioned much like the political and literary salons of 18th century Paris. They were centers of culture, but also of information and influence. A samurai and a merchant, who could never interact as equals in public, might find themselves enjoying sake together at a party hosted by their shared Oiran. She was the hostess, the muse, and the quiet center of a hidden world of power. At the very peak of the Oiran's influence, while she reigned as the undisputed queen of culture, a new star was rising in the floating world. This new figure was more accessible, more affordable, and represented a different kind of artistry. She was the geisha, and her growing popularity would mark the beginning of a profound shift in the culture of entertainment, signaling the first twilight of the Oiran's dominance. The distinction between an Oiran and a geisha is one of the most misunderstood aspects of this world. They were not the same. In fact, they were created to be opposites. For much of the Oiran's heyday, the two coexisted peacefully, occupying different roles in the ecosystem of a single evening's entertainment. A grand banquet might begin with the arrival of several geisha. They were the party starters, the social lubricant. Their lively shamisen music, cheerful songs, and clever drinking games would create a festive atmosphere. Hours later, after the guests were warmed up and the party was in full swing, the climax of the evening would arrive. A hush would fall as the Oiran made her grand processional entrance. The geisha would respectfully retreat to a supporting role. The Oiran was the main event. The geisha were the opening act. The name geisha itself, geisha, means art person. Their entire purpose was defined by that name. They were there to entertain through their artistic skill. Their training, while rigorous, was focused on performance for groups. Oiran training included all of this, but had the deeper, more demanding layer of preparing her for intimate, one-on-one intellectual companionship. Crucially, the government created laws to protect the Oiran's business. Geisha were strictly forbidden from forming personal relationships or sleeping with clients. So why, then, did the geisha star begin to rise? The reasons were a combination of economics and evolving taste. First was the prohibitive cost and complexity of hiring an Oiran. The multi-stage ritual was beyond the means of all but the wealthiest men. The geisha provided a perfect alternative. A man could hire geisha for an evening and enjoy a sophisticated party without bankrupting himself. At the same time, tastes were changing. A new aesthetic ideal known as Ikki was taking hold. Ikki suggests a chic, understated, and effortlessly cool elegance. It was about appearing sophisticated without being flashy. For the truly confident merchant class, the magnificent opulence of the Oiran, her heavy costume and crown of jewels, could sometimes seem a bit vulgar, a bit new money. The geisha's style, in contrast, was the very definition of Ikki. Her kimono was made of the finest silk, but was often more subdued in color and pattern. Her hairstyle was elegant, but less ornate. She tied her obi in the back in a simple, neat knot. She represented a more modern, more restrained vision of Japanese beauty that resonated deeply with the times. Her appeal was quieter, more subtle, and for a growing number of patrons, more alluring. Over time, dedicated districts for geisha, known as hanamachi or flower towns, flourished in cities across Japan, most famously in Gion in Kyoto and Shimbashi in Tokyo. These operated separately from the licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara. The geisha had carved out her own world, and as the 19th century progressed, more and more patrons were drawn to her accessible artistry and chic, modern style. The Oiran was still the queen, but her kingdom was beginning to shrink. The rising popularity of the geisha was a challenge to the Oiran's cultural dominance. But the final blow, the one that would extinguish her world forever, came not from within the floating world, but from the complete and total upheaval of Japanese society itself. The sun was setting on the era of the samurai, and with it, the sun would set on the Oiran. The catalyst for this change was the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853, which forcibly opened Japan to the world after centuries of isolation. The shock of this event led to a period of intense national crisis, culminating in the Revolution of 1868. Known as the Meiji Restoration, it swept away the Tokugawa shogunate and set Japan on a frantic course of modernization to avoid the fate of other Asian nations that had been colonized. This revolution dismantled the entire social structure that had given birth to the Oiran. The rigid four-class system was abolished. The samurai, the Oiran's most prestigious and foundational patrons, were stripped of their status, their swords, and their stipends. The warrior class, with its unique code of honor and its taste for classical arts, ceased to exist as a legal entity. The Oiran's core audience had vanished almost overnight. A new elite rose to take their place. Industrialists who built factories, politicians in Western-style suits, and military officers trained in European tactics. Their tastes were different. They were fascinated by the West. In this new, rapidly changing Japan, the Oiran began to look like a relic. Her elaborate rituals and classical poetry seemed to belong to a bygone feudal age. Some Japanese modernizers even began to view traditions like the Oiran's procession as shameful, embarrassing artifacts that would make Japan look backward in the eyes of the Westerners they were so desperate to impress. The Oiran, once the pinnacle of fashion, was now profoundly unfashionable. Her world did not end in a single day, but faded in a slow, melancholic twilight over decades. By the late 19th century, the grand processions on the Kano-cho were rarer. The tea houses were quieter. The district became less a center of power and more a tourist attraction, a living museum of a lost world. The Great Fire of 1911 was another devastating blow, a physical destruction that mirrored the cultural one. The final, official end came much later. In 1956, the modern Japanese government passed the Prostitution Prevention Law, which outlawed all forms of paid sexual contracts, formally dismantling the system. What little remained of the world of the courtesans was now illegal. The last women who had undergone the authentic training lived into the mid-20th century, living memories of a culture that had long since vanished. And so, the sun set on the floating world. The Oiran, once the radiant centers of a vibrant culture, faded from reality into legend, their stories preserved in the silent beauty of the woodblock prints they inspired. Their world of silk and ceremony was replaced by a new era, but their story remains a testament to a unique form of female power in a world that tried to contain it. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this story has brought you some calm and fascination. As you drift off to sleep, may your dreams be as rich and colorful as the world of the Oiran. Good night. The sun has set on the floating world. The lanterns of Yoshiwara have long been extinguished. Its songs have faded, and its magnificent queens have passed into the silent realm of history. And yet, they have not vanished. The Oiran live on, in the vibrant colors of a woodblock print, in the plot of a timeless play, and in the enduring questions they leave behind. Now, as our journey comes to its gentle close, we enter the epilogue. Let us take this time not for new stories, but for quiet reflection on the legacy these women left behind, a legacy of art, confusion, and a strange and beautiful form of power. In the modern mind, particularly in the West, the rich and complex tapestry of female entertainers in old Japan has often been flattened into a single, misunderstood image. The words Oiran, geisha, and prostitute are frequently used interchangeably, blurring crucial distinctions and erasing the unique realities of each. As we relax and let our minds drift, let us gently untangle these threads, bringing clarity to these figures in our memory. Let us first remember the Oiran, the subject of our story. As we have seen, she was the absolute pinnacle of the courtesan world. She was not simply a woman available for a night. She was a cultural institution, a luxury brand, an artist, and an intellectual. Her life began with a contract of indenture, a form of servitude born from rural poverty. But from that unpromising start, she was transformed through a decade or more of the most rigorous education imaginable. Remember the endless hours she spent mastering the arts, the discipline of the tea ceremony, teaching her grace and precision, the spiritual focus of flower arranging, the pain and dedication of learning the shamisen and the koto until her fingers were hard with calluses, the intellectual labor of mastering classical poetry and literature. This education was the foundation of her value. It was what made her a companion worthy of a feudal lord. And remember the rituals that surrounded her. The slow, deliberate process a patron had to endure simply to earn the right to sit beside her. The 3 formal meetings, each one a test of his wealth, his manners, and his spirit. This was not a simple transaction. It was a formal courtship where she, the courtesan, held the power to accept or refuse. Her business was the selling of a complete, immersive fantasy of romance, art, and intellectual connection, of which physical intimacy was only a part, and never the most important one. Her appearance was a reflection of this spectacular status. Recall the image of her procession. The impossibly tall black clogs, the magnificent weight of her layered silk kimono, and the sash, the obi, always tied in a large, flamboyant knot at the front. Her hair, a heavy sculpted masterpiece, glittering with a fortune in tortoiseshell and coral hairpins. She was a peacock, a queen, designed to be overwhelmingly, breathtakingly opulent. Now, let us turn our minds to the geisha. The word itself, as we have learned, means art person. This name is the key to her entire identity. Her role was strictly that of an artist and an entertainer for groups. She was the life of the party. She would enter a banquet room and fill it with energy, playing music, leading sophisticated games, and engaging guests with her charming and witty conversation. The geisha's training was also rigorous, but it was focused on performance. She was a master musician, a graceful dancer, a charming hostess. Her purpose was to create a lively and refined atmosphere. Crucially, by law and by custom, she was forbidden from competing with the courtesans. The services of a geisha did not include physical intimacy. She was hired for her art and her social skill, not for a personal relationship. Her appearance reflected this different role. Where the Oiran was opulent, the geisha was the ideal of chic, understated elegance. Her silk kimono was of the highest quality, but often in more subdued colors and patterns. Her movements were graceful, but unburdened by towering clogs. And most visibly, she tied her obi in a neat, compact knot at her back. Her hairstyle was simpler, her makeup less stylized, her hair ornaments fewer and more delicate. She was a sparrow to the Oiran's peacock, an embodiment of refined, accessible beauty. Finally, we must remember the countless other women, the lower-ranking prostitutes, like the hashijoro, who sat behind wooden lattice. Theirs was a life of quiet desperation, a world away from the glamour of the Oiran or the artistic prestige of the geisha. They had no extensive training, no powerful patrons, no cultural influence. They were simply trapped in a system of direct and often brutal exploitation. To conflate the Oiran with these women is to erase the very hierarchy that made Yoshiwara what it was. The Oiran's power was exceptional, and it was built upon the foundation of this much harsher reality. So why does this confusion persist today? Much of it stems from the 20th century. After World War II, during the American occupation of Japan, many soldiers encountered women in the service industry who might have referred to themselves as geisha girls to seem more appealing and exotic. This created a lasting, but incorrect, association between the word geisha and the profession of prostitution. Later, Popular works of fiction, for all their beauty and narrative power, sometimes blended the distinct roles of these women to create a more dramatic story. Over time, these subtle and vital distinctions, so clear to any resident of Edo, Japan, became blurred in the popular imagination of the outside world. To remember them clearly is to honor the unique history and the very different lived experiences of each of these women. The world of the Oiran may have vanished, but we are left with a vast and beautiful archive of her existence. Her image, her style, and her spirit were captured and immortalized by the great artists of her time, leaving us a visual record that is both a historical document and a profound meditation on a fleeting world. Her primary legacy is one of art. Let us think for a moment about the gaze of the artist. When a master like you tomorrow sat down to design a print of a famous Oiran, what did he see? He saw more than a beautiful model in an expensive dress. He saw the very embodiment of the ukiyo philosophy. The Oiran was a perfect, trenchant beauty. Her fame was brilliant, but short-lived. Her world was one of high drama and deep emotion, hidden behind a mask of perfect composure. In painting her, the artist was painting the soul of his era. He was capturing the love of fleeting pleasure, the celebration of style, and the deep melancholy that always lies beneath the surface of a world dedicated to fantasy. The Oiran was not just a subject for these artists. She was their ultimate muse. Let us picture one of these prints in our minds. Let us walk through it with our imagination. Perhaps it is a print by the artist Harunobu, known for his gentle and poetic scenes. The Oiran is not in a grand procession, but in a quiet, private moment. She is standing on a veranda, looking out at a garden newly covered in snow. Her face is turned slightly away from us, her expression unreadable, but suggestive of deep thought. Let us look closer at the details the artist has given us. The delicate line of her neck, exposed above the collar of her kimono. The intricate pattern on her robes, a subtle design of winter plum blossoms. The soft, quiet steam rising from a cup of tea that sits forgotten beside her. The print captures not just her appearance, but a mood. A moment of quiet contemplation in the life of a woman whose existence was almost always a public performance. These prints were not just art. They were desire made tangible. For a man who could never afford to be her patron, owning a print of her was a way to possess a small piece of her magic. He could hang it in his home and admire her beauty, dreaming of the world she inhabited. Beyond the silent world of the woodblock print, the Oiran's story was also told on the loud and dramatic stage of the kabuki theater. The lives of famous courtesans, their love affairs with powerful men, and their dramatic sacrifices became the inspiration for some of the most popular plays of the era. A famous example is the play Sukaroku, Flower of Edo. The hero of the play, the dashing warrior Sukaroku, is in love with a woman named Ajimaki, who is the top-ranking Oiran in Yoshiwara. Their love story, full of danger, intrigue, and loyalty, was a sensation. The historical Oiran became mythical heroines, their lives transformed into epic tales of romance and tragedy. This cemented their celebrity status, making them characters in the grand drama of Japanese culture. Of course, we must approach this artistic legacy with a gentle sense of perspective. The art of the floating world was, by its nature, a romanticization. The woodblock prints show us the glamour, the beauty, the poetry. They do not show us the child sold into servitude. They do not show us the crushing weight of a debt. They do not show us the loneliness or the illness that were also a part of this life. The artists painted the fantasy, not the full reality. And that is part of their power. They preserved the dream of the floating world, the ideal that the Oiran represented. They immortalized her not just as she was, but as her world wanted her be, a perfect, unattainable vision of beauty, art, and emotion, forever captured in elegant lines of ink and brilliant fields of color on soft paper. Though her world is gone, the image of the Oiran has not been entirely relegated to museums and history books. In modern Japan, her memory is kept alive, not as a figure of entertainment, but as a treasured part of the nation's cultural heritage. Her story continues to be told through respectful reenactments, festivals, and modern media. The most famous of these revivals is the Bonsui Sakura Matsuri Oiran Dochi, a festival held every April in the city of Tsubayama. Let us imagine ourselves there for a moment. The air is cool and filled with the scent of thousands of cherry blossoms, which form a delicate pink canopy over the streets. A crowd of thousands of people, families and tourists alike, lines the road, waiting in quiet anticipation. Then the procession begins. The music starts, and the participants appear. These are not courtesans, but local volunteers and actors who have trained for months to take on these roles. They are dentists, shopkeepers, and students, all filled with a deep sense of community pride. You see the parasol holder, the young Kamuro in their matching kimonos, and finally, 3 women dressed in the full, magnificent costume of the Oiran. They wear the heavy, layered kimonos, the towering clogs, and the glittering hairpins. They perform the slow, hypnotic, figure-8 walk, the suriyashi. The crowd is silent, captivated by the sight. It is a moment of time travel, a window into a lost world. This is not a commercial performance. It is a community's tribute to its history, a living display of cultural memory. Behind these events is a dedicated group of historians, museum curators, and costume designers. They work meticulously to ensure that every detail, from the pattern on a kimono to the style of a hair ornament, is as accurate as possible. This is not about playing dress-up. It is a serious act of scholarship and preservation. They are treating the culture of the Oiran with the same respect they would give to the armor of a samurai or the ritual of a temple. The Oiran's image also echoes in modern media, where her story is often reinterpreted for a new generation. The 2006 film Sakuran, for example, tells the story of a rebellious and fiercely independent courtesan in Yoshiwara. The film is famous for its stunning and anachronistic visual style, blending historically accurate costumes with modern rock music and a vibrant, almost psychedelic color palette. It captured the fiery spirit and the defiant pride of a woman determined to live on her own terms, even within a cage. It presented the Oiran not as a passive victim, but as a punk rock survivor, introducing her story to a global audience. Her archetype also appears frequently in Japanese manga and anime, where she is often portrayed as a figure of immense power, beauty, and hidden sorrow. These modern portrayals continue the tradition of the woodblock print, mythologizing the Oiran and ensuring that her story continues to fascinate and resonate. It is important to distinguish these respectful cultural revivals and artistic interpretations from the shallow, commercialized Oiran experiences that are sometimes offered to tourists. These often present a highly inaccurate and simplified version of the culture, reducing the complex identity of the Oiran to a mere costume. The true echoes of the Oiran are found in the events and the art that approach her story with the depth, nuance, and respect that her history deserves. They remind us that she was more than just a beautiful image. She was the center of a complex and fascinating world. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, and we are left with a quiet, lingering question. What was the nature of the Oiran's power? Her existence was a profound paradox, a contradiction that is difficult for our modern minds to fully grasp. She was a captive, sold as a child, and bound by an inescapable debt. Yet she was also a queen, a celebrity who commanded fortunes and influenced culture. She lived in a gilded cage, but from within that cage, she ruled a world. Let us reflect on this paradox. Her power was derived directly from the system that confined her. It was precisely because Yoshiwara was a walled-in, self-contained world that she could rise to the top of it. Outside those walls, she would have been just another poor girl with no prospects. Inside, she could become a goddess. Her power was not freedom from the system, but a form of mastery within it. Imagine a magnificent and rare flower, which can only grow in the soil of a very specific walled garden. The walls that limit its reach are the very same conditions that allow its unique beauty to flourish. Consider her economic power. It was immense and very real. Atop Oiran was the center of a vast economic ecosystem. Her success supported dozens of people directly, her attendants, her maids, her dressers. But her influence spread much further. The success of kimono makers, cosmetics producers, wig makers, tea house owners, musicians, and even the woodblock print publishers was tied directly to her fame and her patronage. She did not just earn money, she commanded industries. She was a one-woman economic engine, a fact that gave her immense leverage and importance within the floating world. And then there was her most personal, and perhaps most radical form of power, the power to say no. Let us think about this for a moment. In the rigidly patriarchal society of feudal Japan, most women had very little say in their lives. A samurai's daughter was married off in a political alliance. A merchant's wife was expected to be obedient. A farmer's wife worked tirelessly with no hope of changing her station. But the Oiran, a woman who was technically for sale, possessed the extraordinary power of refusal. As we have seen, she could reject the wealthiest and most powerful men in the land if their character did not please her. She could not be bought out of her contract and forced into a marriage she did not want. This right of refusal, this agency over her own associations, was a form of freedom that was denied to almost all other women of her time. It was a power born of her immense desirability. Because everyone wanted her, she had the luxury of choosing. Her story forces us to complicate our understanding of words, like power and agency. It reminds us that people can find ways to build meaning, status, and influence, even within the most restrictive of circumstances. Her story stands in stark contrast to the silent, unrecorded histories of millions of other women of her era, who lived and died without ever having their names recorded or their images captured. The Oiran had a voice. She had a face. She left a record. In the end, the women of Yoshiwara, faced with a world that sought to own and contain them, did not just endure. They created. They built their own world within those moats and walls. A world with its own rules of beauty, its own hierarchies of status, and its own definitions of power. And at the top of that world, they reigned. The story of the Oiran is a quiet reminder that power can grow in the most unexpected of places. It is a story painted in silk and shadow, of art and ambition. Thank you for letting the sleeping scribe guide you through this fascinating world. Now, let the story fade. Let the details soften. There is nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well.